the human mind cannot answer. Out of reach, past all we can see, hear, and touch, beyond all we understand, lies the extraordinary. The extraordinary is the hidden strength that allowed Cindy Dunlop, a paraplegic, to rescue her drowning baby daughter. Cindy had not been able to get herself out of the pool for 12 years. This day, she had to save both of them.
I knew I was the only one out here. Nobody could hear me, and I just had to do it.
It is the night this young soldier appeared outside his Melbourne home.
Night, Jack.
On the same day, he was killed, fighting on the Western Front, on the other side of the world. The extraordinary is the psychic prediction given to actress Debbie Reynolds that her husband had gambled away all her money and that she would soon divorce him.
I thought I was happily married, and I didn't know I was in debt, and I knew nothing of any of this.
It is the frightening memory of Elizabeth Hardy, who knew she would die in a plane crash, and the man who heard her describe her own death.
This would have to be the most extraordinary thing that I've ever heard of in my whole 34 years of airline flying.
It is the day these two German shepherds proved they were man's best friend. The rescue of a total stranger and a bond that continues beyond the grave.
I've lost a friend. Without him, I wouldn't be here today. And I spent a lot of time with him after the accident.
Just some of the stories that lie beyond our normal understanding. Tonight on The Extraordinary.
Boyd Symington was a very lucky man. More on his freak rescue later. Good evening, I'm Warwick Moss. From the fields of bloody battle, we hear stories of impossible human endurance, of the limbless somehow crawling kilometers through a jungle. We hear of superhuman strength in crisis. It is all about survival. It is all about the will to live. In our average lives, we rarely tap the depths of our own resilience. From the United States, Mary Hughes brings us this story of a woman who has reached her limits and gone well beyond them more than once.
It was real cold, and swam across to her, and she was just limp and purple. She's floating on the top. She hadn't sunk yet or anything, so she was still floating face down. So I had to swim to her.
It is one of those cold winter days in the California desert. Those days when the sun can burn, but water temperature is frigid. Cindy Dunlop is fighting a life and death struggle in the family swimming pool. Her little daughter, Kyla, has fallen in. Kyla is unconscious. On the face of it, the scene is as dramatic as imminent tragedy can get. Yet on this day, there is more danger here than meets the eye. For as she struggles to save her only daughter, Cindy knows too well the precipice the baby Kyla faces in these moments. Little Kyla is at that halfway point between life and death, a neverland in which those who have been there say the human spirit must make a choice to go on to the hereafter or fight for life. Years earlier, in another place, a car accident had left Cindy facing that same precipice.
But I knew I had to make a decision. Kind of like being on a fence and, you had to decide which way you were going to go. all of a sudden I was just back in my body and I had all this pain. It was either, do I want to go towards the quiet and the peacefulness, or do I want to keep on living? And I think I just decided I wanted to live.
Cindy's confrontation with death happened 12 years earlier when she was 17. The Jeep she was driving to school in the nearby desert overturned on a bend and crushed her ribs, punctured her lungs, and fractured her shoulder blades. And the accident did something else. It completely severed her spinal cord, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down for life. And so the dramatic rescue attempt that is taking place in Cindy Dunlop's desert swimming pool this October morning is against far greater odds than meets the eye. Though Cindy could swim, she had never before gone into a swimming pool without her husband's help, and she had never been able to get herself out.
I could never get out by myself. You know, I just never had the strength to do it.
Yet now, here at her isolated farmhouse in the remote high desert of El Mirage, 145 kilometers northeast of Los Angeles, Cindy finds herself in freezing water, without the use of her legs, her baby daughter drowning, and nobody around to help. It will be up to her, alone. When it happened, Cindy's husband Ron was an hour and a half away at work. Yet he would have trusted no one to rescue their daughter that day more than he trusted Cindy.
I've always known that Cindy could do whatever she had to do. You know, I never doubted that at all.
When somebody tells me I can't do something, I usually do it. So I'm stubborn that way, you know, just to prove I'm wrong, I guess. I don't know.
It was this determination to ignore handicap that brought Ron and Cindy together in the first place.
Moving out here really helped me grow up a lot that way, you know, independent-wise. And I found I could do just about anything I needed to do.
And it was Cindy's determination that overruled the best medical advice that she not attempt to have her baby Kyla in the first place.
It was something I think Cindy always wanted to have a kid. We knew the risk involved. I mean, the doctors had told her not to have a baby for health reasons. But she wanted one. And as she said, when doctors tell her not to do something, she usually does just about the opposite.
But Kyla was born without a problem. They call her their miracle child. And Cindy took on motherhood solo in the desert. Then came this morning in October of 1986.
Ron went to work, and Kyla and I just had breakfast, and just were gonna spend the morning out in the sun. We were out there playing and stuff, and then the phone rang, and I went to answer it in the garage, and didn't think I was on that long, but I heard a splash, and I kind of thought, well, I better check her, because, you know, our dog did swim in the pool, so I thought, well, it's probably just the dog, but I'll go check. And so I hung up the phone, and I went out there, and she was floating face down in the pool, so I'm sorry.
It's okay.
The seconds that followed would define Cindy Dunlop's place in the world. For all her past courage in the face of handicap, these next few moments would put her to the ultimate test as an independent woman and as a mother. The morning of October the 7th, 1986, is as vivid and chilling to Cindy Dunlop as if it was yesterday. As a paraplegic bound to her wheelchair, Cindy would be put to the test of her life. It happened suddenly, in the quiet sunlight, as she played in the backyard with her daughter, Kyla.
Cindy's husband, Ron, had gone to work a couple of hours earlier. Cindy and her miracle child, Kyla, were playing together in the sun in the backyard of their remote desert home. The quiet of the morning was broken only by the sound of the phone ringing round the corner from the patio.
Kyla, Mommy has to get the phone. You wait here, okay?
Cindy casually rolled her wheelchair to the house, where she kept an ear on Kyla's movements in the backyard. She could hear her playing with the ball just out of sight, and Kyla seemed safe for a few moments.
Hello? Hi, how are you? I'm just outside playing with Kyla.
While Cindy talked on the phone, Kyla amused herself. It seemed like less than a minute had passed when Cindy noticed she couldn't hear Kyla's sounds anymore. And then she heard a splash.
You know, I just heard something. I'm gonna have to get off the phone right now. I'll call you back later. Bye-bye. Kyla? 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 Kyla!
In that frozen moment, Cindy's past and future flashed before her. Her daughter's life was at stake. Her role as mother and protector was on the line.
I just kept thinking all the way there. I thought, you know, how am I going to get in the pool? What am I going to do?
In that instant, Cindy Dunlop made the most critical decision of her life. Without her legs to support her frantic efforts, Cindy battled over and over again to push Kyla's dead weight from the water.
I got her to the side, and then I couldn't get her out. She was too heavy, too limp. And then I just finally, dove under and pushed up with my head.
Minutes were wasting, and then finally, with a burst of sudden strength she still cannot explain, she had done it. But Kyla still wasn't breathing. She balanced on her elbows, drew herself up, and managed to force a breath into the baby's mouth. Then another, and another. And then, as Cindy had chosen life over death 12 years earlier, Kyla made her decision. There was a sputter. Water ran from Kyla's mouth, and Cindy heard the sweetest sound of her life.
She finally gasped a couple times and started crying, and that was good to hear her do that.
Till this day, Cindy does not know how she performed the second impossible feat of this morning. She pulled her arms over the edge, her shoulders, her torso, and somehow she was there. Even when she was out, Cindy realized she had emerged at the far side of the pool, at the corner where Ron usually helped her out. From there, Cindy could see the baby's limbs were limp, as though she were in shock, but at least Kyla was breathing. Now she only had to get to her, and then the phone.
I knew I was the only one out here. Nobody could hear me, and I just had to do it.
The journey back to her baby into the house would be almost as epic as the rescue itself. But it was a journey that would allow their lives to go on, that would see Kyla grow into the healthy, beautiful 8-year-old she is today. They crawled toward a future that would never have been, of Kyla learning to ride a horse, of playing average kids' games like mastering a skip rope, By the time Cindy completed her agonizing crawl to make the emergency call, Kyla was breathing normally. Soon her neighbor was there to help. Ron was racing back from work. And Cindy's family was reunited. On that October morning in the El Mirage High Desert, an extraordinary woman found herself at the brink of catastrophe and made an extraordinary decision.
It's sometimes easy to look from a distance at the rich and famous and presume that all that glitters really does come from golden lives. But scratch the surface of Tinseltown, and often we find that even for the biggest celebrities, the glow has come from within. We called on one of Hollywood's all-time greatest leading ladies the other day and learned a lot about true grit.
Singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling, I'm happy again. Off down the lane with a happy refrain and singing, just singing in the rain. You know what you're leaning on?
She is 61, yet she works her audience with the energy of a 16-year-old. The age Debbie Reynolds was when she did her first Hollywood movie.
And I forget what movie I had. A first kiss was with Dick Powell.
It was a romantic debut which launched Debbie Reynolds on a career as America's sweetheart. It would also lead her to the bad years as America's heartbreak kid. While she was reaching superstardom in hit movies like Singing in the Rain, How the West Was Won, Tammy and the Bachelor, and the unsinkable Molly Brown, the private woman, Mary Frances Reynolds, was being torn apart. Her personal agony would burst into the headlines in 1958 as the dumped wife of singer Eddie Fisher. Eddie left her for Liz Taylor during Liz's grief over the death of husband Mike Todd. Before producer Todd's death in a plane crash, Debbie and Eddie had been the storybook couple.
A radiant bride and a handsome groom, Debbie and Eddie are finally Mr. and Mrs.
Liz and Mike had been their best friends. Under Liz Taylor's spell, Eddie had left Debbie holding the baby. It was a notorious and messy affair, but throughout her life, it has been under such stress that the unsinkable Debbie Reynolds has shown her strength. Her statement to the press that swarmed outside her house during the scandal is still widely regarded as the classiest response of an aggrieved wife in Hollywood history.
I am still in love with my husband. I am deeply shocked over what has happened. We have never been happier than we have been in this past year. Eddie's a great guy. Do not blame him for what happened. The separation was not my idea.
It was that public appearance on her doorstep that instantly transferred the humiliation to Liz and her lover Eddie and restored Debbie Reynolds' dignity before the eyes of most of the world. And to this day, Debbie credits that poise to a higher power.
Press were asking me many questions. 100 people were in my front yard. Everybody wanted me to give a statement, and I thought to myself, how can I give a statement about this? I'm feeling very upset, deeply distressed over this, and I know I won't say anything right. So I just took a tablet and a piece of paper, and I started writing. And I tried to think, what would Jesus say? What would God do? How would they handle this? And I just wrote all my press statements myself, but I didn't really. Someone else really did. But my pen just went.
It was like automatic writing?
I think it was just giving me the right insight, the right words to put down.
It was a moment that has been preserved as one of the cornerstones of Debbie's strong relationship with her daughter, Carrie Fisher.
I saved all the scrapbooks for my children to read, and my daughter said, "Who did all your press for you, Mother? Who did all of the press releases about the breakup?" And I said, "God did." And she laughed. She thought I was being clever. She said, "Oh, come on, Mother. Who was the head of the studio then?" I said, "I wasn't at the studio then." "I did. I wrote them, Carrie." "Mother, they're just too good, you know." I said, "Well, I didn't say I really wrote them. I told you who I wrote them." And I explained the story, that I prayed, that I put the tablet in my hands and the pen, and the tablet wrote itself.
Those dark days were 35 years ago, and Reynolds says she has learned to forgive, if not forget, the Eddie and Liz affair. But it would not be the last time her husband would leave Debbie devastated, nor would it be the last time the world would see her triumph over the cruelest odds. At the end of 1960, she married Harry Carl, a one-time wealthy businessman who, for 10 years, secretly emptied Debbie's bank accounts with his gambling debts. Debbie hadn't a clue until one day, on impulse, she visited renowned psychic Jean Dixon.
I thought I was happily married, and I didn't know I was in debt, and I knew nothing of any of this. And she saw me, and when I walked in, she said to me, "I'm so sorry to hear about your marriage, your divorce, and all of your debts, and it's so awful for you to have to start all over again." She said, "You're filled with anxiety, and you're filled with nerves, and what do we call it today, stress, and you're feeling what's wrong, and you don't know how to fix it. Well, you'll have to fix it. You'll have to divorce."
Shocked by Dixon's psychic prediction, Debbie went home and confronted her husband, Harry Carl.
Well, when I came home, I told him that I went to see a psychic and that she expressed a feeling to me that I had financial difficulties, and do I? And he hemmed and hawed, and he said, "Well, there are a couple of problems, but I don't want to bother you with them." I said, "Bother me. I have to know." So he wouldn't bother with me. He denied them, so I went to the business managers. They had to tell me. Then I hired a lawyer to delve into it and to find out. And of course I was totally exposed and broke, that they had absconded with all my money, they and my husband. And what she said was exactly the truth. So I divorced him. I left him. The banks took all my homes. I had 3 homes. When I married my husband, I had a few million, and I had a home, and I had 2 cars, and I had nothing at the end of this, and $2 or $3 million in debt. It took me 10 years to pay it all off, and plus raise 3 more children of his.
Since that day, Debbie Reynolds has learned to take life's hardest knocks and get back up. That's exactly what she is doing here at the Debbie Reynolds Hotel in Las Vegas. She insisted on paying off all her husband's debts and starting over again. She works every day, improving her hotel, saving to build her own theatre wing, with the energy of the unsinkable Molly Brown.
Have you overcome the hurt? I've overcome the hurts that happened to me in the past. I have many to bear. I know I have yet more to come. I accept challenges. I walk out of my house. When I walk out of my house, I'm vulnerable. But I prefer life like that. I prefer to be curious and to experience life than to stay home on the sofa with my African.
During the Great War, the Western Front became a place of legends, myths, heroism, and brutal death. In faraway France, the free world fought for its survival. Thousands of young Australians played their part in holding the line against the enemy. Sailing from our shores, young diggers did not know if they would ever see home again, did not know if they would return to loved ones and friends. Each and every one of those soldiers had love of home and country in their hearts, and a fierce determination to return to the land of their birth. It's October 1917. The Great War in Europe is into its 4th ferocious year. young Australians are fighting and falling beside their allies in the war to end all wars against the Germans. Their thoughts are of king, country, survival, and their families back home. In that year, Elizabeth Morgan was a teenager in Melbourne. Her life and the lives of all her friends were dominated by the war. She was about to have a brief encounter, an encounter which would remain part of family folklore for more than 70 years.
Good night, Jack. It was something my mother told me many, many times throughout my life, and something that I never ever got tired of hearing, was when she was 18, 19, living at home with her parents in a very narrow street in Port Melbourne.
It's a story that Elizabeth Morgan's daughter, Pat, has passed down to her children and grandchildren. Pat's mother and her parents followed the war day by day, battle by battle. Her mother's sweetheart was fighting on the Western Front, and so was her close friend and neighbour, 19-year-old Jack Thomas.
Jack Thomas was a private in the 39th Battalion from Victoria, which was part of the 3rd Australian Division. That division launched one of the last Australian attacks on the village of Passchendaele on the 12th of October 1917.
Obviously, Peter Stanley, an historian at the War Memorial in Canberra, knows the details of the campaign in France and Belgium intimately. It was a campaign in which 500,000 Allies would lose their lives. Among them, 38,000 Australians. While the war raged, Elizabeth Morgan was doing her bit on the home front, working at the South Melbourne markets. On that fateful night in October 1917, she was headed home after a long and busy day. In the distance, she saw a figure in uniform, a young man she thought she recognised. As she got closer, the figure became clearer. It was her friend, Private Jack Thomas, standing under a street light right in front of the Morgan house.
Good night, Jack. When he didn't answer, she thought perhaps he hadn't heard her. But of course, my grandparents were in the front room and they heard her call out to him. When she entered her home, her father asked her who she'd been talking to.
Who was that you were talking to?
And she said, Jack Thomas.
Jack Thomas?
Jack Thomas is in France, dear, fighting at the front.
My mother said, well, perhaps he's home on leave. She said, I definitely saw him.
And for the moment, that was that. The next day, Elizabeth Morgan's encounter and Jack's mysterious silence were all but forgotten. It was a sunny spring afternoon, and the Morgans were making the most of it. When...
Would you like a cup of tea, Father?
Don't mind if I do.
The visit by the parish priest was unexpected. A visit that in those dark days could mean only one thing.
Terrible, terrible thing. Just got the news this morning.
What's happened, Father?
Father Callahan went to tell the Morgans of the tragic battle at Passchendaele, of the heroic struggle by Australian troops to take a strategic ridge, of the cable from military headquarters he'd received that morning. The cable that reported the death of their neighbour and friend, Jack Thomas.
What? Jack's dead.
Jack's body was never found. He's one of 6,000 Australians whose remains were never recovered from the battlefield of Passchendaele. He's one of the unknown soldiers that we remembered last November when we interred the unknown Australian soldier at the Australian War Memorial.
Good night, Jack.
So, how could Elizabeth Morgan have seen Jack Thomas that night? Maybe it wasn't Jack after all. Maybe she was mistaken. Maybe it was another young soldier home from leave.
The only Australians to return from the war during the war were men who were wounded. No Australians got leave to come home until the very end of the war.
Elizabeth could never explain her brief encounter. All she could ever say for sure was that she'd definitely seen young Jack. It wasn't her imagination. It wasn't a ghost. It was him in the flesh.
She was convinced that she had then seen his spirit return home, perhaps to try and comfort his family.
The news was a dreadful shock to Elizabeth Morgan. Someone so young, so close to the family, so much like her own sweetheart. Many, many more Australians would die in those last stages of the Great War. But never again would the parish priest visit the Morgan family home. Elizabeth's young man, Ernest, would make it home safely.
When my father came home, he proposed to my mother in a most unusual manner, told her he was going to marry her, and she said, "Oh, are you?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "I've already asked your mother," and she said, "It's all right." So.
And 3 weeks later, he did just that. Ernest and Elizabeth were married and, as they say in the fairy tales, lived happily ever after. But throughout her life, Elizabeth never forgot her encounter with Jack Thomas, the story that eventually she was able to relate to her own daughter, Pat.
She used to always say to us, "Never be afraid of the dead. They'll never hurt you. It's only the living that will hurt you."
Good night, Jack.
Man's best friend he may well be, if he knows you. But what would make a pair of German shepherds risk their lives for a man they had never met? To plunge into a flowing river to rescue a complete stranger? We may never know the answer, but there's one thing Boyd Symington is sure about. An invisible bond was created that day, one that can never be broken.
He was prepared to put his life on the line for somebody else that he hardly knew.
There is no doubt in any of our minds that the dogs actually calculated to go out and save him, and they really understood the urgency of it, and even when the dogs got out, the dogs were quite emotional, the same as what we were. It's a day I'll never forget. We all had a good cry later that day.
It was also a day of courage, unique courage of the canine kind. A human life saved by two of the bravest dogs in Australia.
The more you teach a dog when it's young.
That day, the hero and heroine were two German Shepherd thoroughbreds, Jester and Leader. They were champions and television stars, with impressive credits including an action drama series and their own training video.
Cross, cross.
One day in February 1984, though, it should have been all play and no work. Jester and Leader were out on a picnic beside the Nepean River, west of Sydney, with their owner, Chris Johnson. Also in the party was a young couple, Boyd and Karen Symington. They were friends of Chris, but had only just met the dogs. A perfect, lazy summer's day. It seemed nothing in the world could go wrong. And nothing did, until Boyd decided to go off on his own.
It was a hot day and I decided to go for a walk along the side of the river, and I was wading knee-deep in water, and unbeknownst to me the river had been recently dredged, and before I knew it the bank had washed out from under me and I was swept out by current into the river. I thought this was it. I went under, I came up, and I didn't think I was going to come out of it at that point in time, but The main thing was trying just not to panic and stay afloat.
Boyd could feel his fear rising, but he didn't dare start yelling for help. He was convinced that would only make him really panic. Nevertheless, Jester and Leader sensed something was wrong, and somehow they joined forces to mount their own rescue mission. According to Chris Johnson, back on shore, the picnickers were dozing, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding in the treacherous river.
I looked up to see where my dogs were, and I realised that Boyd was right out in the river with the two dogs, and Karen jumped up and was looking out, and my first impression was how silly Boyd is being out in the river and taking my two dogs out there, because one of the dogs was very old and I was frightened that my dog would actually drown. And Karen suddenly started screaming, and she said Boyd couldn't swim, and it was at that stage I panicked and I realised that the three of them were in real serious trouble.
The first dog reached me was a younger female shepherd, Leader, and when she got to me I grabbed her and twisted her and pulled her under. We both went under together. I let go of her, not wanting to drown the dog, and she swam away a bit. In the meantime, the larger male Jester came close to me and I was able to grab hold of his tail.
For 5 long minutes, Jester battled the current and the odds. One rapidly tiring dog, trying with all his might to tow a fully grown young man to safety. To Boyd at the time, it seemed like hours. It seemed they'd never make it. By now, Chris and her friends knew what was happening. They feared the worst and felt entirely helpless. In the water, Boyd, who couldn't swim. On shore, the three of them who couldn't either. But as Boyd and Jester edged closer and closer to the bank, they managed to form a human chain, and desperately they reached out toward the exhausted pair.
We grabbed Jester first and started dragging Jester up out of the river while Boyd continued to hold on to Jester's tugs. Had Boyd let go, he'd have been just swept back again by the current. And then we managed to grab hold of Boyd and we hauled the two of them out, and the pair of them just collapsed exhausted on the riverbank, and Boyd was crying and the dog was just exhausted.
A truly amazing feat of courage. And more amazing still when you remember that Boyd hardly knew his two rescuers. As his wife Karen wrote later, "I will never forget that day when Jester and Leader placed an almost total stranger ahead of themselves. There are no braver dogs in all the world." Sentiments that were echoed across Australia. Jester and Leader were hailed as heroes and showered with awards. In July 1985, they were named the bravest dogs in the state of New South Wales. As for Boyd Symington, it's not too strong to say that he grew to love his rescuers and was totally devoted to them. 3 faithful friends for life.
It seemed as though the whole urgency of the atmosphere made Leader and Jester great friends with Boyd. And in fact, Jester ended up so close to Boyd, it was almost an uncanny friendship the two of them had. It was as though they were just meant for each other. And Boyd used to visit all the time until Leader died. And when Leader died, Boyd was too upset to come to my house for a year or so. So I used to take Jester to visit Boyd.
But one visit was different. Jester had been ill, and Boyd must have felt he'd never see his special mate again.
I said goodbye. The dog didn't want to leave me. I had to physically carry him and put him in the car. And several days later, he was dead. It's a great loss. I've lost a friend. Without him, I wouldn't be here today. And I spent a lot of time with him after the accident. So, still to this day, I miss him.
When an inferno raced through the town of Laguna Beach in California, one house remained standing,
I stayed up the whole night watching TV without seeing anything that resembled my neighborhood. But the next morning, as President Clinton started his speech, they faded into a picture of Laguna Beach. And it was by helicopter, and suddenly I saw this big white house. And it took me a little while, but I realized it was my house.
The only house not insured. The only house blessed by a Vietnamese monk. An incredible tale of survival. An untold story. Next week.
A remarkable story indeed. Don't miss it. Before we go tonight, an update on a story from last year. It concerned air hostess Elizabeth Hardy and the chilling premonition of her own death. The premonition came true when ANA Flight 325 crashed into Botany Bay, killing all those on board.
I'm worried about flying tonight.
Why?
I had a dream. One I told you about.
Oh, don't worry about that. Liz, it's only a dream.
Look at the weather tonight.
I know, but it's only a dream.
But everyone... It was more than a dream.
After the story aired, we were contacted by Captain Don Dorwood, who spoke with Elizabeth Hardy shortly before she died.
Elizabeth Hardy's girlfriend rang me up and said, I wish you'd have a talk to her. She's actually predicting that she's going to die in an aeroplane. So I went over there and I had a talk with her, and I said to her, look, you've been watching too much TV. These things don't happen. She said, but I know I'm going to die in an aeroplane. I said, well, look at the facts. We haven't had an aeroplane crash for a long, long time, and the chances of you dying in an aeroplane are so slim that you should worry more about driving your Volkswagen to the airport. On that particular day, she went to the airport and she didn't want to go flying. She was crying. She was terrified. And her supervisor said, well, look, if you don't go flying now, every flight you do from today on will be a drama and you just won't be able to fly. So go up, come back, and then you'll know it's not true. Well, before she went, Elizabeth Hardy said, tell my best friends that I send them my love, I'm not coming back. That's how convinced she was. But she had the determination and she went flying. 10 minutes later, she was dead on the bottom of Botany Bay. On that terrible night of the 30th, after the aeroplane had crashed into Botany Bay, I thought about it. And I thought, how did that girl know that she was going to die in an aeroplane? Because this would have to be the most extraordinary thing that I've ever heard of in my whole 34 years of airline flying.
By the way, the reenactment for that story was shot at Wobby's World Theme Park in Melbourne, which features a complete Viscount aircraft similar to the one that crashed. And finally, before we go, a look at another story from next week. It's about a father's desperate attempt to get in touch with a long-lost daughter. Freak circumstances that saw a message delivered 50 years after it was written. Good night. See you in the future.
If he had written before then, I didn't get the letters because a lot of mail went astray at that time. And maybe I wasn't meant to get it. It's hard to know. And this is why I think it's strange that he should correspond with me by putting a letter into a bottle when there's such a thing as an envelope and a stamp.